Content warning. Film Fiends discusses movies that often feature extreme and/or offensive subject matter. You have been warned.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Film Fiends, the podcast where we talk about all things related to horror films. My name's Alex.
And this is Bryant.
Thank you so much for joining us again today for our fourth episode. Today, we are going to be talking about inventiveness in horror.
That's right. We had a lot of fun with this one, and it was surprisingly challenging.
Definitely.
Or I think we had first described it as we want to talk about creativity. How do you bring something new, novel? How does that present itself in horror? What does inventiveness and creativity look like? And gosh, unfortunately, there's an infinite number of possibilities for that.
Even just defining what that means for an episode, I think was a little bit more complex than we had initially given it credit for. And we did end up pushing this episode back a little bit, and it honestly may have been to our benefit in the end, just because we got a little bit more time with it. And I think we've ended up at a point where we're both pretty comfortable with the topic, and we found out how we want to treat inventiveness or ingenuity in horror. We'll often talk about, originality of ideas. And I'm sure if you're in the creative field, you've heard that, nothing is original. All stories have been told, that kind of thing. And that kind of further complicates the question here of, what can we really talk about in terms of unique expressions in the horror genre?
Very true. So for me, I came up, I think, with a couple different ones. Like I said, there's kind of any number of things you can land on, but I think I had a couple different ways, especially with the movies we've chosen. Today for inventiveness, I chose New Nightmare. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, also known as A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 7.
7, folks. How many of you out there didn't know that there was 7 Nightmare on Elm Streets? Don't answer that. I know you're horror fans, so you probably all knew. But still, would that have been the pick for today? Would that have been what you guys thought came up? I wonder. But it turns out it was a fantastic choice. It actually really showcases a lot of what we're talking about.
True. And when we start launching into that kind of more formally, I'll get into exactly why I chose it or why it was something that I feel demonstrates creativity. You may especially be wondering why part 7 of something, what's creative or original about bringing Freddy back again, but we shall get there.
I was going to say, I think that's like one of the coolest aspects about the fact that New Nightmare is on here. We're talking about originality, and it's the 7th installment in a franchise. Like, that already is a cognitive dissonance that'll be really fun to unpack. But leave our intro there for the moment, and we'll go to our first recurring segment called Horror News. I'm going to pass this over to Bryant as he gives you an update on the stuff that we can be expecting in the horror genre.
Well, as theaters kind of get opened up slowly, I think it's still area to area in a lot of ways. And for me personally, I am still just streaming a lot of stuff, especially on the same day HBO Max's releases.
It's so convenient. I love movie theaters, and I will be one of the first people to go back when it opens locally in my area. I'm both vaccines plus 2 weeks, so I'm feeling pretty comfortable. But despite all of that, streaming is just so incredibly convenient that where I would maybe in the past go out and see like movies that I kind of knew were going to be crappy just because I wanted to see them. I wanted to put out those numbers for like ghost films, for example. I may just stream those in the future because it's so much easier.
And once the price point gets under control, they need to stop asking $20 personally.
Gosh,
but
honestly.
I will pay $6. I will pay like 6/10 of a theater ticket. Come on, that's pretty fair, I think.
Just about to say, I think they land on the $20 being like, oh, well, this is kind of what you'd pay for the theater experience anyway. But it's like, yeah, but I'm not getting that.
You're also assuming that you're going to get the value with 3 to 4 people chipping in.
Sure,
on
I
some
guess
of these
that's
event
true.
Movies,
That's
which
actually
is
a good
kind
point.
of less and less true during the pandemic as well, or should be less and less true during the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, what was the one they charged a ton for? Mulan?
You had to subscribe to Disney Plus, and it was a $30 rental.
Yeah, which is $30. See, that's insane. And I didn't watch it for that reason. Mulan is okay. We're sidetracking a little bit from horror here, folks. But just so you know a little something about your co-host Alex, Mulan is my favorite Disney movie. So I was ready to see it, but no, I'm not paying $30 for a movie. Like, that's more than a theater price. I mean, it's like 3 times as much as a theater price, not including, popcorn and drinks and stuff. But
there's several movies, especially the Oscar movies right now that are still at $20. Like, not even
crazy
franchise blockbuster movies that are trying to make back $300 million.
Yeah, sure, right.
I'll pay $6. I've paid $6 quite a few times.
Exactly. All right. Well,
okay, but
rants.
we are actually getting into what's coming out now, because since things are opening up, things are getting released. Some of Quiet Place 2 is coming end of May. But before that, we get Edgar Wright's newest movie. Kind of for horror people, I think the biggest thing would be Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, yeah.
His most recent one, Baby Driver, was a step in the not entirely a comedy direction.
So bizarre to me that those are by the same person, too.
And I think this is going to be even further. From what I have heard, it's firmly in the psychological thriller with even maybe a bit of a psychedelic aspect to it. So
fans of Midsommar, eat your heart out.
Yep. They got my attention, that for sure. Also coming in on Netflix, quote unquote, sometime. So don't hold your breath.
Oh, good.
But I in my research, I found out that Henry Selick is making a new stop motion, hopefully masterpiece.
Oh, I mean,
he's known for A Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline, which I believe was still his last movie.
So he's 2 for 2 right now.
Yeah, he's and then I think James and the Giant Peach was his other,
which is creepy,
not necessarily a horror classic, but I think
it's
a
creepy
children's
as
classic.
hell. Though.
Yeah,
I mean, it was one of those films that I saw Nightmare pretty young. And actually really liked it. It never spooked me too much. But James and the Giant Peach freaked me out as a kid. That freaking shark thing with the rotating mouths. I don't know, man.
Wendell and Wild is what that one's going to be called. Keep an eye on it. Key and Peele will be involved. So I think are the main 2 voices.
Yes.
So just that'll be kind of your cue what to look for on that one.
Well, and it means Jordan Peele's involved too, which is great because he's fantastic.
And the next one, I think we're just going to reach a couple months into the future here. Early June, so less than 2 months. We got Conjuring 3.
Let's go.
We did Conjuring last episode. I know Alex is a huge fan.
So
he
excited.
made me a fan. So
yes, that's right. Maybe we'll even see it in the theater, huh, Bryant? Go make a theater trip for Conjuring 3.
Oh, well, it's the same day HBO Max, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, gosh dang it. I'm never getting Bryant out of the house again, guys. It was already so hard to get him to the theater before.
No, you can come over for that one.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. I think that's gonna wrap it for horror news here.
Perfect.
Just keep an eye out because we're gonna get more movies, more in production.
Yep.
So,
keep an eye out. Tune in here. We'll always be happy to keep you guys updated. We think it's a fun little introductory segment to the show, just to keep everyone abreast of what's going on in the culture and in the field, and especially during pandemic times, which fingers crossed seem to be waning a little bit. It was not always easy to keep up with all of these projects. Things would go from Quiet Place 2 had a billboard driving to San Francisco saying that it was going to be coming out May 2020 until like January of this year. And then they finally took it back down. I may have mentioned that last episode. I can't remember. But anyway, we'll wrap up horror news there. Keep an eye out, keep an ear out. So main topic for the day. Inventiveness in horror. And we're going to be talking about New Nightmare. And then, I actually don't know if I mentioned that the film that I'm going to be talking about today is Hereditary. You guys have heard me mention Hereditary a couple of times on the podcast already, and you'll probably hear me mention it a bunch more. Rewatching it for the episode, I think has solidified that it is my favorite overall horror movie. I've always listed it in my top 3 as Hereditary, Alien, and Ringu, the original Japanese Ring. But I think firmly Hereditary is in that top spot.
It was such a big event of the past 10 years. I don't know. We've been very blessed recently, but Hereditary may outshine a lot of the kind of rallying points recently, even more so than Get Out and The Witch.
I agree, which also are fantastic. Everything in that category of just new, modern, like very artistically... How do I want to put this? Like artistically honest films, or like art forward kind of horror, I guess. Stuff that doesn't feel like schlock,
I believe the people have started calling it new horror renaissance is the term I've heard a lot of the time.
Everything in the new horror renaissance has been absolutely incredible and has absolutely rocketed to the top of my favorite horror films, to be honest. And I've always been more of a modernist kind of horror fan, contrasting Bryant a bit. But that new horror renaissance has been like candy for me.
Same here. Yes. It's,
So good. So good.
I think my favorite of the past decade though was Raw, which I don't think
so
I don't think gets mentioned quite as often as Get Out or Hereditary.
It really
But it also got a release from Shout Factory, a really nice Blu-ray last month.
Oh, whoa. Okay.
Which I'm actually looking for pretty quickly here.
Let's do it. Yeah, that's amazing. Raw is incredible. I showed it to a bunch of my friends when it first came out, and it is just fantastic. Anyway, sidetracking again a little bit. You can tell we're having a lot of fun with the episode. I think we're going to start with New Nightmare, and we're just going to talk about, some of the things that we found were really original and really creative and really unique about the film. And it is the film that Bryant chose, so I'm going to kind of hand it over to him. Bryant, why New Nightmare?
That's true. Something that you had mentioned earlier in the intro was that there are no new ideas in storytelling. So especially with established characters, there is kind of this sense of we are going over familiar ground again. What do you do?
Sure.
I come from a lot of comic books.
Oh, yeah.
I used to work at a comic shop, and something that attracted me to a lot of series, especially in, I think, what they call the English or the British invasion in the 80s with Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and Alan Moore,
okay,
is that they would take over defunct characters that hadn't been published in decades, characters that didn't on the surface appear to have a lot of value to them. Mostly forgotten about. So there were characters that the publishers would let these guys experiment with or kind of give carte blanche to.
That was like Sandman and stuff like that?
Exactly. Or? Neil Gaiman, the Sandman was originally, he was a crime fighter with like a gas mask on that would like shoot people with like a gun that would let like a sleeping gas.
Wait, what? I had no idea.
He would like put you to sleep and stuff.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
I think there was a Silver Age revival that's referenced in there. There's one Neil Gaiman Sandman story where some demons convince somebody that he's the Sandman, and it's some like comic book character.
Love it.
I want to say that's the Silver Age kind of iteration of it. So Neil Gaiman, of course, comes in and basically ignores everything that had come before.
Smart.
But it's still the same copyright trademark that DC owns. But for me, I was thinking Alan Moore's Swamp Thing is one of my favorite comics. And then Grant Morrison's Animal Man is another kind of goofy one.
I was going to say, I don't know if we've talked about that one before, or if we have very briefly.
It's a goofy one about a guy who can take whatever quote unquote power from animals around him. Like if a bird's nearby, he can fly, etc.
Okay.
So it's a silly kind of dumb power.
Sure.
But Grant Morrison told this story where he eventually realizes that he's a character in a comic book.
Oh shit! Okay.
Yeah. He becomes self-aware.
Good. He's Deadpool before the Deadpool.
Yes. Okay. And he travels to the real world through this limbo of forgotten comic book characters that exist in between the normal continuity and the real world, where people have forgotten about them.
Okay, quite on the nose with that one then. I love it. He's brought in to deal with these defunct characters, and then his character has to go through a realm of defunct characters Okay, all right.
So one of the things that I always look for is how do you approach something that's come before and be inventive with it? And I think a lot of times people can fall into the trap of just kind of tweaking it a little bit, or you just got to get a new angle. And while novelty is important, you are trying to find something new. So that is by definition novel. It's not novelty for novelty's sake. What I found a lot of these creators were doing with comics was looking deeper into it. Is you have to take a stupid idea absolutely seriously, and then you can kind of find the heart in it.
I really like that. I like a lot of my favorite media tends to take itself very seriously, not in the sense that there can't be jokes or there can't be any levity, but that it's never like elbow nudging the viewer like, isn't this so goofy? Look at the stupid stuff we're doing. Sidetracking again a little bit, and just for a second, some of my favorite anime is that way, where some really ridiculous stuff is happening, but the anime treats it like it is serious within its own continuity, and there's something that's really special about that approach.
That does make me smile as well. This is going to be another bit of a sidetrack, but I watched the first episode of Jujutsu Kaisen last night.
Good. So good.
And the thing that struck me the most was that it's completely normal that there's a school full of superpowered kids. And then what's different is all of the supernatural stuff, like on top of it.
Right.
It's this totally like genre convention that's accepted as completely normal.
Yep.
That's invaded by like a horror show.
Yes, absolutely. And Jujutsu Kaisen, it has some horror elements. I mean, we don't talk about anime on here really, but I've read the manga, and there's some, its aesthetic is definitely very like horror film in some senses. But anyway, won't sidetrack on that too much.
That's true. So let's actually get into New Nightmare here.
Yeah.
So I talked about it's about taking that idea of something that's come before and really breaking it down to its core element and then rebuilding it back up. I think one of the things that I will get into a lot of the time is the difference between deconstruction and synthesis. I may have mentioned this on an earlier episode. I know I've talked Alex's head off about it before.
We've talked about it, but I don't think it's actually been on the podcast before. So definitely give us that rundown. Real quick as well, do you want to give them a synopsis of New Nightmare just for anybody who hasn't seen it?
I'm going to get there.
You got it. Okay,
yeah.
Go for it. Sorry to interrupt.
No, yeah, no worries. I've been kind of foolish and left my notes at home, so I am going off my memory of
For
what
once,
I wrote.
I have more notes than Bryant does.
He does.
This time.
Alex is more prepared than me today.
I'll take it this once.
All right. So, yes, deconstruction. I think a lot of people think of deconstruction as an end of itself, or as like something like kind of a higher purpose of art. But for me, it's something that's necessary for the second part. I think it's important to see something broken down into its pieces so that you can put it together again in a novel way. I find that synthesis is kind of a higher form of it because it also requires deconstruction first. You have to take it apart before you can put it back together again.
And anybody who's listening probably does understand those terms, but just in case, in art with something like film or novels or even anime, deconstruction is taking a well-known genre, taking those tropes and kind of stripping them down, breaking them apart and looking at them in a different way. A lot of the times people will... Again, I'm sorry, listeners. I'm going to use another anime example here. People will look at something like Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is ostensibly a mecha kind of giant robot anime, but it's really much more concerned with, what actually happens if you tell a 14-year-old that he needs to be in this extremely dangerous situation trying to defend the Earth when all he wants to do is reconnect with his dad.
Sure. Personally, I've always found Evangelion to fall on the synthesis side, even though it is always described as a deconstruction of the giant robot genre.
Right.
I've always felt that it had very profound things to say about the human experience, especially with mental health.
Sure. And like you said, being a synthesis does not preclude the fact that it's also a deconstruction, which is really good for this conversation.
One does need the other.
Yeah, exactly. But synthesis is basically just that second step of after you deconstruct something, you make it into something else using those same parts. Oh, sorry, I bumped the mic there a little bit, guys, if you heard that. We are actually using mics for the first time today. I'll just mention real quick. We were using a field recorder before. Shout out again to D-Pro Productions, who's allowing us to borrow his mics for this episode. And then we're probably upgrading to, buying our own soon. But for the time being, this is our first attempt with mics and cranes and whatnot. So forgive us if there are any small hiccups like that. I do apologize.
But if it sounds like a whole new show, that is definitely why.
Exactly.
I'm excited about it. I think it's
me too.
I think it's a new episode 1 almost in a way.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so sorry, Bryant. I keep interrupting you.
No, you're all good. We need to fill time.
That's right.
I've been sitting here trying to collect my thoughts and write it out and stuff.
Yes, exactly. I'm giving him time to recompile his notes.
So getting into New Nightmare. We mentioned before, it is the 7th Freddy movie.
Crazy.
You've had 6 of them. They've gotten progressively dumber, goofier. They finally killed Freddy off. So you're sitting at this point, well, what do you do with this? What sort of novelty is there to be found? You've gone through already 5 sequels of trying to keep it fresh and original. So you do have to look deeper and go through that entire process, deconstruction, synthesis. So looking at Freddy, you have somebody that's become a pop cultural icon, probably somebody that's more famous than he is scary nowadays. I think you have a character that when he appears on the screen, people cheer. That's an issue if that's your horror villain.
True.
So what happens then? You have to acknowledge that and say, well, what does that say about the society that embraces Freddy? What does the popularity of this stuff say about the society? And also, what does this material do to you? What does it do to the people that work on it, let alone the people that watch it and have such a personal connection and want a statue of Freddy and want to dress up as him for Halloween or whatever it may be?
I mean, there was 5 sequels. It was obviously a successful franchise. People loved it.
Exactly. So we're left with this question of, well, how do you explore this further? And it is taking a meta step back, as New Nightmare does, and has a movie about the creators of the movies, the special effects artists, the star of the first and third film, Heather Langenkamp, comes back.
From Scream Queens, shout out.
Exactly. She's in all of my favorite ones of the New Nightmare series. I believe I mentioned in that episode that her presence does make every one that she appears in better.
She's definitely a Scream Queen. I mean, after having watched, I actually watched Nightmare on Elm Street and then New Nightmare for the first time in preparation for this episode. And yeah, she's, I kind of wish I had watched it before the Scream Queens episode because she really fits that bill like perfectly.
And it also has a good appearance from Wes Craven, who's a little stiff, but we always...
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite subplots of the movie is that Wes Craven is writing a movie that is the movie that you're watching. However, there's a lot of insight into the creative process of writing, so that does land for me a lot.
That actually might have been one of my favorite parts of the movie. It actually was really cool and worked for me really well. I'll just mention 1 or 2 things here really quick and let Bryant get back to it. New Nightmare is a meta kind of movie where, like you said, it's following around the cast of they had shot Nightmare on, I keep wanting to say Nightmare Before Christmas because we talked about it earlier. Nightmare on Elm Street. It's after they've finished shooting 6,
yeah.
And then they're getting, it's literally you're getting back together for the 7th, but it's happening in a meta sort of way because it's in the movie. I really love. At no point do they break the 4th wall. I'm just going to mention that real quick. We'll get back to that in a minute. But then, there's when you meet Wes Craven in the movie, like the script on his computer, like it kind of pans to the next room or they enter the room or something. And it's like writing out the dialogue as they're having it in like script format. And that was just like amazing.
That was one of my favorites as well.
So cool.
I gotta say,
I geeked out on that. I was like, "Oh man, that's awesome!"
And especially when Wes describes some of the things that are happening, you're like, "Oh, I just got to the point where the son tries to reach God."
Oh, that's so creepy.
And
it's like through the friend. It's through the person who like plays Freddy. It's like I was talking to Wes and he's saying all this weird stuff, but it's like the events that are actually transpiring in the film. Mm-hmm. So good.
Oh, and gosh, what a fun role for Robert Englund, who gets to have it like 3 different ways.
Totally.
He gets to play himself, which is great because he plays himself as kind of a goofy artist.
Yep.
He's like oil painting and stuff.
Yep.
And he also gets to play, I think, normal Freddy once or twice.
Yep.
But he also gets to play new Freddy.
Yep.
Which I should probably explain because it's a big part of the premise of the movie, is that, well, while they were making the first 6 Nightmare movies, it became such a big part of the public consciousness that it trapped the spirit of this old evil entity, demonic entity, into it, where this old ancient evil now has assumed the guise of Freddy.
Right.
And now that Freddy has narratively died in Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare, the evil is free and trying to break into the real world from the fictional world.
Right.
And it's gotten used to being Freddy, and it really likes to be Freddy.
Right.
Which is kind of funny.
It is.
Yes.
And as Wes Craven puts it rather eloquently, I'm not going to be able to quote verbatim here, but he says something to the effect of like, the only thing that can stop this evil entity is storytelling. You tell a story about it, and I guess it's kind of like you desensitize the population to it, and so it loses its power or it traps it a little bit. I'm not sure exactly the mechanics there, but super cool.
I've often talked about it's the facing down of the horror. And I think it's that aspect of storytelling. That you're facing it directly. And that's often been a theme of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Remembering the first movie, it's the idea that your attention gives something power.
Sure.
That's been there since the first one, and it's when she turns her back on Freddy that Freddy loses his...
Right, she's like, you're not real, and then,
Yeah. And then, there's a kind of twist ending, which I've often kind of just discarded.
That ending is so bad. Like, I watched this again for the first time recently and like, loved the movie. And then the end is like Freddy car. Like, it's literally just
and when the mom gets pulled through the window
it's
and it's a big
terrible
fake
dummy. Like, it's not even close to believable. And then it's like, that's it. That's the end. You're like, wait, what?
So I've often kind of just ignored that and told myself that the resolution is that it's your attention. It's the fear that you give something that gives it its power.
I think that's the better takeaway.
And here in New Nightmare, it's accentuated to the point where there is a definite give and pull between fiction and reality.
100%.
Something from fiction is coming into reality. One thing does affect the other.
Yep.
In a way. Like Alex said, it's the defeating of the evil is through storytelling. I think all writer likes to tell themselves that there's a societal value in kind of going through these narratives and kind of giving people some sort of comfort or closure, or narratives help us organize and understand our life.
Absolutely. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, this also could be a commentary on how horror helps people process like scary and painful events that they don't obviously want to ever encounter in real life. But there's still something about the human like psyche and consciousness that catharsis is still really effective for us. Even if we never want to be chased around by a serial killer, there's something that you gain by watching it happen that is kind of hard to describe and actually may kind of reflect what Wes is saying here about how storytelling is the way to defeat that big bad evil, quote unquote. Yeah, I don't know. I never actually thought about that.
Which I believe it's his answer to horror films have a destructive influence on society.
Because that comes up a couple times in the movie.
Yes, he is directly acknowledging that, especially in the effect that it has on children.
Yep.
Heather Langenkamp's son sees a bit of the original Nightmare on TV, and it's arguably the inciting incident that's kind of trips him up. Even though he's sensitive to this new Freddy breaking into the reality and that's what's happening.
Right.
A lot of people, including the psychiatrist, read it as he's just getting influenced by these horror movies.
Yep, he ends up in the hospital a little bit later, and the first thing the nurse says is like, well, you didn't let him watch those horror movies you made, did you? And so there's a little bit of like a guilt trip on Langenkamp as well, where it's like, just because she was participating in these movies, which is it's her job and her livelihood, like that's somehow a bad influence on her child, which was an interesting commentary as well.
That's true. And I think not just the child, I think a couple people even suggest on society as well, that as the creator of these movies, you're putting negative stuff out there.
Sure.
Celebrating killers and yada, yada.
It's not an uncommon point of view, honestly.
No, but I really like how New Nightmare deals with it.
Handles it very well.
Exactly. And also, one of the things that I do like is that it also does touch on that. Yeah, as you do watch more and more horror movies, I won't be the one to argue that they destroy society or corrupt the youth. However, as you do get more and more desensitized or as you seek out more extreme stuff, you do need to ask yourself what that's doing to yourself. If you don't have a limit anymore or it doesn't affect you, well, that's kind of something that you honestly need to kind of talk to yourself about. Or from a filmmaking sense, it is one of the last ways to actually truly scare a horror fan. Where if you can pull that meta trick on them of watching what you're watching is bad for you in a way,
right?
You remove that safety net of anything is just happening in a movie,
absolutely,
and suggest that the power of the movie itself is having some sort of impact on you.
100%. And Nightmare has actually always kind of had that power. I actually remember learning about Nightmare Before Christmas as a child Wow, I said it
Oh,
again.
yeah, it's
Nightmare on Elm Street. Gosh dang it. I'm blaming the mics. No, I'm just kidding. But Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't think I ever watched the first film. I think I've caught snippets of it and its sequels and whatnot. But actually, just like New Nightmare posits, I was aware of Freddy and knew about him without ever having to see his films as a child. But the conceit of Freddy, that he's going to get you when you go to sleep, is actually that same kind of vein of like telling the horror fan. It
totally is.
Yeah, the same thing is telling the horror fan like, oh, this is going to mess you up in a meta way because what you're doing is watching these movies. You're not protected from this anymore. In the same way that when I was a kid and I would watch a horror movie and then go to bed and feel comforted, it took that away from me. It took away the like, oh, well, now I can sleep and I won't be scared anymore. It completely flipped that on its head and said, no, you have to keep being scared because Freddy's going to get you in your dreams.
Because he can exist in your dreams. Like, you can literally have a Freddy dream.
Yes, literally. You know, like in real life.
You're not going to wake up in the cut, hopefully.
Probably not. Probably not.
But yeah, Freddy can actually exist in your dreams in the same way that he exists in the story.
And that's
it's a fun trick to pull on people. You're not safe when you're asleep.
It's just kind of a brilliant thing that Wes Craven came up with, and he just kicks it up to the next level in New Nightmare by taking the same sort of logic but applying it to horror fans. And it's both really scary things to think about as a horror fan, honestly. Like, I'll mention really quick that I don't like just consume horror, and I will take time when I'm feeling like a little horrored out or, you know, a little desensitized. I'll kind of go to lighter stuff. So I don't feel like I have that problem too much. But at the same time, Bryant and I have talked about different like cutoff points in horror for us. And there's some places I can go a lot farther than he does, and, vice versa. And so it's definitely something that I think all horror fans do think about at some point.
I'm really sensitive to a lot of the new French extreme. Because I think I find a lot of nihilistic attitudes at the heart of it. It's not just that it's extreme.
It's not just the torture.
It's the viewpoint that I don't necessarily agree with.
Sure. Well,
so I find myself kind of mentally battling with a movie where I may respect the construction of it. It's filmed well, it's written well, it's edited well.
And it's scary.
But I don't agree with it.
Sure. And I mean, I think,
yeah.
And actually, funny enough, that I think is a big plus for me. I actually really like nihilistic movies because I think it makes it scarier if the conceit of the movie is like, you're screwed either way kind of thing. And not always. Some things can do this kind of the wrong way. But also one of the big reasons why I'm such a huge fan of Japanese horror is that they often have a really unknowable and unstoppable kind of dark force coming after you. And it's like you may have tripped up some rule without even knowing it. And because of that, the ghost is going to come and kill you and you can't do anything about it. And that's just scary. When it comes to the French extremism, that nihilistic sense of like the world is evil and no matter what good you put into it, it's not going to stop what's happening, is... For me, that makes horror really intense, and it's a plus for me. But I can see how that would be
it's like there's no logical this follows this into this, and there's a meaning to it. Like Irreversible, it plays it backwards,
right,
so that you can't follow this into this into this. I mean,
right.
You can like reverse you can reverse put it back together.
Sure, but that's not the point.
The whole point is that here's violence,
yep,
and then here's events.
And it doesn't matter.
And you can't draw meaning from those events.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's just a commentary on how senseless violence does exist in the world, and you're not always going to be able to make sense of it,
And that's my definition of a difficult movie.
Oh my gosh.
Challenging movie.
Absolutely challenging film.
So I think I'm kind of getting to the end of what I liked about New Nightmare. The meta-ness of it. It's the reinvention of a character. Yeah.
Cool.
It's that meta sense of kind of messing with your horror audience.
Sure.
I think it's something that Cronenberg brought up in Videodrome. That I think we may be revisiting that theme as well.
Absolutely. I think we may be coming up on that here soon. Mm-hmm. New Nightmare. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to say about it before we switch gears here. I really enjoyed it. I will mention that I haven't seen as much classic horror as I probably should have, especially when it comes to sequels. I haven't seen a lot of the 4, 5, 6, 7s of those really popular slasher and other kind of horror franchises. I've only seen Hellraiser 1, for example. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I have not seen all of the sequels. Hills Have Eyes, I haven't seen the sequel. Things like, or I guess that was the newer sequel. But anyway, point being, New Nightmare was incredibly good. I really, really enjoyed it. It was very effective, and it was extremely creative and had a lot of inventiveness. There was something that I really appreciated about the movie in that I think because so we talked a little bit about in a recent Instagram post that Bryant had made about artifice and how embracing artificiality in film can lead to a more realistic experience than just trying to emulate reality. And there's something that happens in New Nightmare, and I don't know if I can place exactly why, but it feels very authentic and it feels very real. It feels like they may have, but it feels like they literally just put a camera in a film set for like the opening, for example, when they're working on a new mechanic and it turns out to be a dream, but whatever. Like it does feel in a lot of ways like you are actually in the real world with Heather Langenkamp and all of this stuff is happening. And now that's not because it's realistic, because it's not. Like it doesn't go to any lengths really to try and convince you that this is reality. But I think maybe because of that, it manages to create this really, really effective artifice that just pulls you in and puts you into that world where Freddy has become real.
Well, it almost suggests that it did happen, and this is a film of like real life events.
Right,
It's this question of what exact level of reality and fiction are you on?
And it becomes more complicated by the fact that script has written itself, or Wes has written it or something.
Yeah, Wes is channeling it from a dream
the ether.
as it's going.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, you imagine Wes sitting there when it's still a script, halfway in between it, and these things have happened in real life, and then he can write what just happened when Heather walked into his room. Like, I assume that like when she leaves, he just goes and like sits down and writes the next scene that I am watching. And,
yep, like it's like Wes is like prophetic, and it's like what? Oh man, it's like what of reality actually happens in that movie outside of the scenes that we see. Does Wes sit down and continue writing? Does that even exist? Because it's not a scene we see.
That's true.
Like, that's crazy.
Yeah. Roger Ebert always had a theory that if you don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Crazy.
Is that there's especially in a film, you can never posit that something is just there. You just can't see it.
Right.
Only what is there on the screen exists in the film reality.
Well, and that goes partly
that's a debatable theory, but
right.
That is, I tend to agree with that. I don't like to go along with readings that are like, oh, well, if you just make up this and this, well, then you can take this from it. That's always like, well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's kind of when you go into like fan theories and stuff. I was actually watching some Hereditary fan theories, kind of prepping for this episode, and not to name anything in particular, but there are a couple that seemingly kind of make up stuff that Paimon can do and kind of like use that to explain some of the events and whatnot. And then it's not that it's far-fetched, but it's like, was that told to us or shown to us, like maybe, but you're kind of grasping straws.
When you're pulling at stuff that's quote unquote real, like there are demonic texts, there are people that light candles on pentagrams.
And apparently Paimon is an actual deity of some sort. I believe he's in the Ars Goetia, which is one of those occult, but I know very little about this kind of stuff, so I apologize.
So it is researched and based on, occultism, but right. I believe that Ari made his own reality.
Yeah, I think so. I think
more or less in a way. However, based on it is. So I think that consulting an actual grimoire as part of your evidence,
I don't know.
Again,
about that.
is a little adding something that's not necessarily in the movie.
Yep.
However connected it is.
But horror fans like to make content.
Yes.
So so I guess we can wrap up New Nightmare there. If there's anything else we can kind of we can circle back to it.
Exactly.
No trouble.
No, I
there.
mean, you had mentioned stuff that reminded me of Hereditary right now, like whether or not people are doomed, and I was like, oh, I thought that was definitely a theme of Hereditary.
Sure.
So I was like, Yeah, actually, let's just talk about Hereditary.
Totally.
Let's swap over.
Perfect.
Let's just shift gears like that.
Hereditary, I think I've said it a million times. I've said it this episode. It's one of my favorite horror movies ever. One of the things that made this episode a little bit difficult for me was finding points to talk about that highlighted the ingenuity and the uniqueness of Hereditary, and not just all the things that it did really well, which some of them are going to be the same. Some of them are different, but I mean, I could talk for hours about all the things I liked about Hereditary, but that's not really talking about anything. That's just me kind of telling you that I think the movie is really good, which it is. And if you haven't seen it, stop this episode right now, pause it, go watch it. We're going to get into spoiler territory to some extent.
That's true. I don't believe I can talk about a couple things without spoiling it. So I'm just going to kind of blanket.
Yep.
I may tell you some spoiler things about Hereditary starting right now.
We're definitely getting into spoiler territory. And I think it was the only reason I didn't bring this up earlier in the episode is I think that you can know the premise of New Nightmare and still get everything from it. Like, you're not going to lose anything by knowing that it's a movie about Freddy coming into the real world kind of thing.
Right.
It's still just as good. In fact, I knew that going into it because Bryant explained it to me, and I still had a fantastic time. It's an amazing movie. But Hereditary is one of those things that you need to watch it for the first time by yourself, ideally without knowing a ton about it. So go do it. Okay. So when it comes to inventiveness in film and in horror, I kind of started thinking of it as three different perspectives. The way that I'm going to be approaching Hereditary and talking about inventiveness today is inventiveness in premise, inventiveness in execution, and inventiveness in aesthetic.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of trifecta that I have created for myself to help me explain and compartmentalize the different thoughts that I have about the film. And they're relatively straightforward, but inventiveness and premise is, I think, the toughest one. And it's actually runs into that question that we had mentioned earlier of like, can you have an original idea? And I think that is sometimes why inventiveness of premise can be a really difficult thing to achieve. Not impossible, but difficult. Inventiveness of execution is taking ideas that may or may not have been done before and doing them in a way that is really creative, really unique. I think there's a lot more room here because you could take the same haunted house or alien story and tell it a million different ways. I don't really know if that well ever dries up, especially given that we're, constantly getting new, film and writing techniques every day, new authors and people that learn how they create in a unique way. And then the last one is just inventiveness of aesthetic, which also is relatively straightforward. It's, taking that same ghost and making it look different. Which I think, again, is also something that probably will never run out as far as people have creative energy and juice that they put out into the world.
Absolutely. I really like how that breaks down, especially in the premise. Because for me, I went back and forth with Hereditary. Do I talk about it the same way?
Sure.
Like, oh, is it about how Hereditary finds deeper themes within familiar cult movies?
Sure.
Kind of. And the first thing that I was about to be like is, well, I really like how it's an update of 70s cult and satanic movies.
Out of like the Charles Manson-y era.
Exactly. Yeah. After Manson, it was kind of, understandably in the public imagination.
Oh boy.
So there was kind of that little rash there, but I think that he tosses back into it in a way that's not just a throwback.
I agree. I think he modernizes it.
Yeah. Another movie that I really love, House of the Devil, I think is also a 70s throwback in a way that doesn't necessarily elevate beyond being a 70s throwback.
Sure.
And Hereditary does.
I agree.
You can talk about how it takes all of those and then gets into its deeper themes.
Totally.
Which I can totally talk about later. I just don't want to step on Alex's toes.
No, that's
but
perfect.
Then the other thing that I started thinking about on my rewatch is, my God, just the level of details everywhere. It's so generous and dense. And that was another definition of creativity, is abundance. Like, it's literally the amount of creativity is
everything
was
foreshadowed.
stunning. So I don't know if that's like I don't know, super self-redundant or apparent, but that was what struck me about Hereditary.
I don't think
on
it's
my third watching.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it's redundant at all, actually, because it was only my second watching to rewatch for this episode. But there was so much that I noticed on this second viewing that I didn't notice the first time, because something about Hereditary, again, this ties into if you haven't watched it before, go check it out. It's very shocking. It is an extremely shocking film. And when you're watching it the first time, there are a good 4 or 5 scenes that are going to smack you in the face, at least if you see it like I did. And that wrapped me up and held me tight through the whole movie. And I was just like, from the first 20 minutes, I was there in the film. And again, we're getting into spoiler territory here, but as soon as Charlie gets her head knocked off, nothing could have taken me out of that film in that theater. I was there and I was in and I was like terrified.
Oh man, that is such a great twist. I remember when that happened, it felt like the floor dropped out from under me.
You're like, what is this movie?
And it felt like we were off script. It felt like like I was still kind of guessing. I was like, okay, the kid, there's probably something with the cult. I'm guessing that the kid's, just partial demon at least.
Sure.
So we'll see how this goes. And then when that happened, it felt like I couldn't predict the next scene.
Absolutely.
It actually felt like that scene in Parasite when the door opens
oh my
and
God,
the
so
stairway goes under. That's like the only other movie I can think of in the past decade that had that, like, I can't predict the next scene.
I agree. And it's so good. It's such a good feeling. Like, I remember that exact thing with Parasite too, because I was having a great time with Parasite, and like, it's funny, but you're not watching a comedy, it has a lot of heart. It's a little sad and it's funny, but until the thing opens, you're kind of like having a good time. And then the door opens and you can see the stairway going into the darkness. And I was like, oh, are we doing a horror movie? I was like, my mind just opened up at that point.
Anything can happen.
Anything could happen. And it's the exact same thing with Hereditary. And actually, for me, it happened a couple of times. And I'll kind of get into that. So
that's true. And you mentioned it's that there's nothing like the first experience, but that doesn't mean that the rewatch isn't worth it.
No. Oh, yes. So that's actually my point I was going to make.
Go for it.
Sorry. Thank you for reminding me for that. My point being that the first watch is absolutely incredible. Just let yourself be in the moment and let it wrap you up. The second watch was where I was able to pick up so many details that I didn't realize before. And it's stuff that like at the funeral, there's a creepy dude in the corner that smiles at Charlie. Obviously, he is a cult member. You can see him naked in the house later on. But like, you watch that the first time and you're like, oh yeah, that's creepy. It's a horror movie. Something weird's going on. But you don't have the wherewithal to put it together. And the thing about watching it the first time is I think it moves so fast and so terrifyingly that it almost tries to not give you the chance. Like, it challenges the viewer to be like, yeah, try and spot stuff if you can, but I'm about to smack you in 10 minutes. So you better keep an eye out,
I'm still catching stuff.
Yes.
And actually, I should say, in preparation for this, Alex actually has the screenplay.
I do.
He has the super cool book. So I spent yesterday reading it, and there were still things in it where I was like, yeah, I just watched this movie for a third time, and I did not see the sigil carved into the telephone pole.
And I did. I noticed it on the second
Alex
one.
Did,
I was like, holy moly. But yeah, A24 makes these really, really incredible coffee table books. It has like the script and then some screenshots and some words from Ari. Really, really cool. A24, killing the game. But anyway, I'll go ahead and get into my 3 main points here in the lens of Hereditary. So I genuinely believe that Hereditary captures all of these to some extent. In terms of premise, I think Hereditary does kind of retread a lot of old ground, but it, draws on those tropes and, I mean, kind of in some ways deconstructs and synthesizes, but I don't think it's that like in depth. I think that they just use stuff that you recognize and kind of turn it against you when they are ready to switch stuff up on you.
That's true. It doesn't spend too much time over explaining things, and I think a lot of the familiarity in the tropes that it's using lets it do that. It doesn't spend a lot of time. You don't ever see the cults and they're all hanging out being like, oh boy, I love Satan. Like,
right.
You already get that.
Right.
You just see like yeah, you see creepy people and you're like, I think
Something weird's happening. Yeah, exactly. So it draws a lot on those cult films of the Manson era, as we were kind of mentioning, to make it feel like really oppressive, make it feel like you're always being watched. I also personally feel like Hereditary leans on some pretty common haunted house tropes as well, even if those do turn out to be red herrings in a lot of ways. Haunted house stories are often dealing with like consequences of the past, as Hereditary also does, and they're also often highlighting a small nuclear family. The house is the primary location of the film, and by the end of it, we're intimately familiar with each hall and each room to the point where we're like almost trained to look for what is going to scare us or trained not to, where there's a couple moments where you've been through these shots, you've been through these houses, and when the mom runs out of the corner, I was ready for it on my second rewatch and I couldn't remember where it was coming from, and it got me again. And there's something about, I think the movie in doing this kind of trains you to be susceptible to those jump scares.
It's pretty great. It's actually really similar to The Conjuring.
Yes.
I looked into it a second and they did it in pretty much the exact same way. The exterior is totally real. I believe it's in Utah, but the interior is completely sets, like The Conjuring.
Yep.
And it establishes the floor plan that's a priority.
With the dollhouse as well. Helps out with that.
Exactly. And you see it in miniature as well as just how they walk around.
Yeah, it's actually very purposeful that they do that. They have the miniature version of the family and they have the dollhouse. And if you are paying really close attention, a lot of those scenes are actually set up to look like you're looking in a dollhouse from like a room cut in half almost. The most obvious one is the very first scene of the film. You zoom in on the dollhouse and it becomes Charlie's room, right? But that same shot is used, or a similar like framing of the shot is used several times. One of the big ones is there's a shot during that dinner scene, I believe, when the mom is storming off, that's just a complete horizontal shot that it literally looks like you're looking into a dollhouse.
Even when they lower Charlie into the ground and it kind of goes past the soil,
Yep.
You're kind of used to that as like a style thing, but it's also super artificial and would probably be what the miniature version of that would look like.
Absolutely. It looks like it's cut off the edge like that.
And something that wasn't in the movie, but in the script, is that in the end mentions that it should be a wide shot of the house made to look artificial, like it's a miniature.
Got it.
So that it would end on the same, it looks like a miniature shot. And I actually went back to see if that last interior of the treehouse floating in darkness, because it's like a close up on the kid, and then you get like a wide of the treehouse, which is it's artificial. It's floating, it's suspended there, and like floating in nothing. But no, I mean it looked real to me. I didn't see like it looked like a miniature or something.
There actually were a couple of points where you're getting really far off shots of the house that I'm almost 90% sure are miniatures. I was looking at them and I was like, I may be wrong, but it looked like maybe just because of how the film was shot, it looked artificial in a way that I think actually kind of benefited it a little bit. Thought it was interesting. Anyway, kind of my point here being that I think taken in a different direction, Hereditary could have easily become a haunted house film, as it already has a lot of the trappings of such. And in fact, on my first viewing, that's exactly what I was expecting. The fact that it twisted and turned into something different was what kind of piqued my interest, and I think is where it really shows that ingenuity of premise. Until it was the Charlie thing threw me off a bunch, but it was actually until the flyer in the door that I didn't realize. I was like, oh, like there's something way else going on.
Yes.
Whereas like I felt like it could have just taken a different direction, been a more self-contained, grandma's haunting the house, or whatever, a demon has possessed it sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess I had forgotten how much there was summoning this demonic entity, trying to talk to Charlie.
Right.
So there were totally more traditional ghost haunted house stuff.
Right, seances.
Because I was kind of going into this being like, it was a cult movie, right?
Sure.
Just cult. Like,
well, and I think, it is, but
it brings in so much more.
When I think that's, I think just for rhetoric, that's one of the ways that you can be inventive with a premise. You take something and you show us the about face. You switch it around on us, or you show us that you can use these same building blocks to make a completely different
Finding
film.
the resonances in two different subgenres.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it works so well. I mean, only
there's
for
almost like Exorcist bits in this too.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
You can talk about like cult, exorcism, ghost stories,
possession.
possessions. Yeah,
it's
all in there.
Completely agree, and I think it's something that does make this quite inventive. Which brings me to the ingenuity of execution here. So in Hereditary, everything is immaculate. The shots are gorgeous. The family dynamic is explosive and tense.
Oh, the characters get better.
Characters
every time.
are deep and well realized.
I kind of thought they were puppets on a string after the first one
Sure.
a little bit, where they're there for the story to happen to them. But
Sure.
boy, after 3, no, they're great characters.
Absolutely,
they're great characters.
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, the dialogue is raw, unabashed. The acting is phenomenal. The tricks and conceits that are used are tasteful and effective. I'm thinking like the tongue clicking thing.
Oh my God, it's
so good
great.
and so well
makes you
realized.
just recognizes you as Charlie and Sinister immediately. I think I had one person that was doing it at work for like the first couple months after the movie came out and was popular, and a couple people would jump like every time.
Yeah, it would scare me. Absolutely.
Yes.
I remember in the first viewing, because they in the second viewing, they do it a little bit more than I thought they did. So it kind of like didn't scare me as much. But in the first viewing, when the mom is driving home after the seance and it clicks in the car with her, I was like, oh my Lord, that scared the hell out of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why, maybe just because it was such an emotional, like sad scene where the mom is really like coming to grips with the fact that maybe she'll be able to talk to her daughter again. And then it just like, and I was like, ah.
One of my favorite ones was actually Charlie's drawing book.
Sure.
It's kind of a joke at first, but then you get that one scene where the father is looking at it and kind of going through Charlie's drawings. That actually really touched me this time, where he gets to the last one, and then there's no more drawings. And I was like, oh, wow, that's a really poignant way.
Yep. Really straight up way to just, Charlie's gone.
The father gets to reveal character without saying a word.
They do that really well in this
passion.
film.
Yes.
A lot of character moments where there's not necessarily a lot of dialogue or necessarily developing dialogue, but you still get so much character from it.
But then you also get the twist of it's actually not the last drawing in the book, which is what I'm talking about. Like the abundance of details is that would have been such a perfect just moment for any other film, but it takes it one step further and makes it this additional thing.
Keeps you thinking.
You thinking. Which is what I'm talking about. The abundance of details is like everywhere you look, there's this thing, but it's not just there. It's resonating with all of this other stuff, and it's going to get called back later. Yep,
absolutely. And that part of, again, why the execution is so good and inventive is everything is foreshadowed, like everything. If you're going back on your rewatches and there's so much you can pick up, it's like,
it's like there's not even unique deaths. They're all the same death. Everyone gets beheaded.
It's pretty much true, actually. Which is, one of those interesting fan theory things I was running into. It's like, why does the cult want their heads gone? It's like, I don't know if there's really an explanation for it, but it's definitely part of the ritual in some way.
That's true. Charlie's making her puppets to have all of the animal heads that she's cutting off.
Yep.
I think she's halfway done, and you see it on Joan's table later.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I mean,
so I don't know what the demonic symbology of that is.
Sure.
It's because the demon has a chicken head or something. Content warning.
Right. Well, I thought so, but I actually on rewatch, Paimon is like, it has like a normal human head. I feel like at some point I had read or heard something that Paimon is sometimes depicted with a chicken's head, and that was why Charlie was making the clicking sound, because it was like a clucking. But I think that's incorrect. I think that was just a misreading that, or maybe somebody applying some lore from outside of the film. I don't know how accurate that is upon a rewatch and kind of a reanalysis, but it's interesting.
Yeah. I know I've talked to Alex before. One of the big things for me about world building is that it's not just like details and that it's all kind of there and written. It's just that everywhere you look has something.
Yep.
And Hereditary has that in spades.
Yep.
It's the doormat that Joan has.
Yep.
It's that all of these little details beg like 3 more questions and kind of hint that there's still even more to this world. When Joan mentions that she had a son and grandson drown,
right?
I'm always like, okay, one, is that a lie? And,
right.
Or were they also sacrificed to Paimon?
Right. Right.
It just kind of begs all of these further questions. And it's not just that the world itself is there, studded with details and seamless. It begs one step further outside as well.
Absolutely. I totally agree with everything you just said. Oh man, such a good film. To continue a little bit about the execution here, the novel kind of execution. Hereditary, like we were saying, dense and thorough. Everything's being foreshadowed, constant hints and nudges. But it's also blazing fast. Like, it never lets go of the reins, and it does everything it can to keep the tension moving, the beats hitting, and the scares scaring. And you might...
It doesn't feel like it stops either. One thing is, it's going into the next thing constantly, so it almost doesn't let you question it.
Right.
And it doesn't feel lightning fast. It doesn't feel like something like I want to say Mad Max Fury Road, but I know there's a horror example I could pick here, but basically something that's like so aggressively fast that you're kind of exhausted. Like, it doesn't exhaust you. It's more just the density of information.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's perfect. I totally agree. My point here kind of just being that you might expect something with such a density of information and world building and foreshadowing to be like a plotting slow burn. If you were to tell me about a movie like this without me having seen it, I would expect that stuff would be getting kind of drip fed to me throughout. And I think a lot of movies that put such a high emphasis on such like thorough information delivery aren't usually as shocking as intense as Hereditary is. And I think that's where one of the most unique ways about how Hereditary is executed is that it's kind of the best of both worlds for me, and that it is really scary and really shocking and thrilling and gripping, but it's also really dense and really thoughtful and really I guess like cerebral is a word I could use, but I don't mean it in the sense that like you have to be thinking about it, or that it's very complex.
I know we weren't going to fanboy, but it's just good storytelling.
God, it's just good storytelling. I don't think I can't not fanboy.
It's just engaging in the way that storytelling is engaging. It doesn't need any bells and whistles.
Yep, I completely agree.
Although the bells and whistles are great.
I
just want to
the fact that they're there.
The cinematography is
so
amazing.
Good.
I love, there's a bunch of warm palettes,
sure,
especially oranges inside the house.
The funeral is like brightly lit, nicely brightly lit, which is an interesting choice.
And then they turn that down for the nights. I don't know if the nights are like cold per se, but they're at least neutral. It at least turns the warm off to kind of have a different, and everything that's half in darkness is some of the best looking half in darkness shots I have ever seen.
So good.
That stuff is so hard to do, just to make everything turn out exactly where you want to see it and still read. It was near perfect.
I agree. I remember seeing the last scene in theaters where Peter is going through the halls and kind of searching, trying to figure out what's going on. And it is dark. Like, I remember it being so dark that I was almost obscured from what's happening, but it was on the perfect precipice of I could still see what was happening, but it was like my mind was like pre-preparing to be in darkness, which is a crazy thing to make me do in like just watching a movie. It was incredible. Very, very good.
And I would also just real quick, it's hard to talk about the editing. I have this note that's like editing, the most like nebulous and hard to define thing is good. But there was one, I think it was during the dinner scene when Toni Collette's yelling at her son, there's a reaction shot of the dad. And I was just like, that's a great reaction shot.
Agreed.
And I think he, especially in the reaction shots, but also just recognizing that it's the flow of the movie is so hypnotic, and they're saying the pacing was so important, and that's in the editing.
Sure.
So I would just like to say, it's notoriously difficult to talk about, but I think the editing is one of the things that maybe doesn't get brought up as much for this one.
Shouts out Hereditary editor, which I wish I had maybe gotten. Well, I guess it's probably more than one editor, so you can't really shout out a ton of people.
Yeah, and you also never know who's in the room. Ari Aster may also
have helped
been
a lot with
in
that.
the room with it.
True,
I know a lot of guys, even if their hands aren't on the controls, I know I want it quicker, linger on this more. Oh, it should this to this.
Sure.
Or,
makes sense.
Oh, I wanted it a little more counterintuitive this way. We want to start close up and pull back, or whatever. Yeah.
Sure. Cool. So I have a couple more
points.
You're
just talking about execution, so I just had to be like, actually, like the elements of this are like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, everything is, yes, exactly. Everything is very well executed top to bottom. In terms of like ingenuity and inventiveness of execution, I have a couple more points to make. Hereditary also manages to defy expectations when it comes to the treatment of the family dynamic. So by and large with, again, I'm going to use, for example, like haunted house movies, which Hereditary is not, but shares a similar family structure. The family is oftentimes united against an outside force. One or two of the family members may be possessed, or the dad may be like, oh, you're crazy, wife, there's no ghosts. But by the end of it, normally they have come together to fight the demonic entity. And, you know, a lot of the times they don't really get characterized very well. There may be one or two focal point characters. I'm thinking something like Conjuring, which, you know, I think there's like 5 or 6 family members, and like I don't remember any of their names, you know, and they're fine characters. There's nothing wrong with them. But when I'm watching horror that is about a nuclear family, just happens to often be haunted house horror, that's kind of the setup that I expect. Hereditary, on the other hand, chose to, I guess I would say, kind of deconstruct this and decide to look at it in a completely different way and make a lot of the horror and a lot of the really unnerving and disturbing parts come from this really thoroughly dysfunctional family. And it adds so much to the film.
That's a very good point. In most of them, it's the family trying to get torn apart. In this one, it's the family is torn apart.
It's already done.
Yeah.
Like, just the fact that the movie starts out with the grandma's death and you kind of, it's like in media res a little bit. You don't really get to start at the start. It's already going.
No, the beginning is letting you know that the dad and son don't care that the grandma died.
Right.
That's the first
That's
scene.
the first scene.
That's where
Like,
you start. Is
the
they're
dad
like
comes
kind
into
of both secretly relieved that crazy grandma that they don't have to deal with anymore is gone.
The dad comes into his room. Is like, how you feeling about everything, son? And the son's like, I'm fine. He's like, you sad at all? And the son's like, eh. And the dad's like, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I feel that.
Right. And it's one of those moments, I think, where it's a little
well, at
off
first
track,
you don't
but
necessarily read into it. It's more, everybody processes their own way.
Totally.
Just that they're a little quiet and a little reserved,
Well, and
could be enough to be grief. But
and after what Tony says about, sorry, I may be switching back and forth between character and actress names here throughout the episode. My apologies. Annie, the mother, Toni Collette. After her kind of speech, you get pretty quickly that the grandma was a contentious figure. So it's like, you don't really think about it, you're just like, oh yeah, maybe they're not too worried about it. We all kind of,
it was about time.
It was about time. Yeah, that kind of thing. So I thought that was really novel, a really, really cool way to approach this. And also one of the reasons why the movie is so poignant to me and so effective and also difficult. Family dynamic stuff, especially with a questionable parental figure, man, that can be really spooky and really unnerving in a really, really human way. Like even more than Payment is.
Mm-hmm.
Those moments where Tony is like maybe gonna burn Peter to death, like that's terrifying in a very real way.
It's true. When people bring it up, I always tell them this is a scary movie, not just for the visceral, boy, it's spooky and the tone. And
Charlie does get her head
you.
knocked off, and that's horrifying.
But thematically, this is a deep movie that kind of gets at stuff that I know scares a lot of people.
Absolutely.
I think for me, it's literally about hereditary. It's about nature versus nurture and whether you're destined to become your parents.
Totally.
The genetics that you get from them, yeah, that's you.
Absolutely.
And I know that idea scares a lot of people. I think, I'd almost call it number 3 behind public speaking and death. Number 3, fear, turning into your parents.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, that is a very common American phenomenon is just, how are you going to turn out?
And yeah, so for me, nature versus nurture was this huge theme of the movie that goes back and forth. And it ties into the fate versus free will.
Absolutely.
Because if you are just destined by your genetics, then that means you don't have any free will.
Right.
And I feel like this movie is always going back and forth between, are these characters trapped like rats in a cage? Are they just miniatures in this diorama that are set to play out this drama and can't do anything about it? Or do they have any agency whatsoever? And I don't think the film makes necessarily a concrete case one way or the other. I think it's something that I I go back and forth every time I watch it. It's every detail says one thing and then another detail puts its hand on the other side of the scale, and I can never quite resolve it. And that's kind of that the endless. I don't ever have the final answer.
Sure.
It's kind of like The Shining.
Sure.
Where I think it's that sort of fearful ghost story of
Yeah.
I can never fully solve this.
Sure.
And that's going to be what always kind of sticks in the back of my mind.
Absolutely. And I think that is entirely intentional from Ari. I think I am actually going to, with my last point on execution here, take a side.
Yeah.
I think that they are firmly rats in a cage, especially seeing so many more of the signs and foreshadowing that are left around upon the second viewing, and just realizing that the cult is orchestrating everything from the start of the movie to the end of the movie. There's little details like the fact that Bryant actually pointed this one out when they come back from the funeral and they kind of scold Charlie for having her shoes on in the house. There's muddy footprints in the house that they're kind of like blaming Charlie for, but that it was likely a cult member, manipulating the house while they were gone. There's words, like ritual words, written on the walls within the house when Charlie is walking outside from her treehouse to like the garden. There's a pair of muddy footprints right next to her that are larger feet. And then you see the person in the woods in a ring of fire, which, I mean, who knows if they're actually there or not, I guess, because Toni Collette doesn't realize, but
no, she doesn't. And it's also nebulous whether it's the grandmother's body.
Right.
As well.
It kind of looks like her.
The script doesn't make a call to the script. It
Sure.
mentions that it kind of maybe.
Sure.
And you're like, oh, wow, that's funny.
Because they did dig up the body. So, I mean, that
the
might
body
have,
has been dug up at that point.
Right.
I'm pretty sure. But yeah, no, random cult members are a pretty constant presence throughout the entire first chunk of the movie.
Yep. Someone mentioned actually they might even have had a couple in the support group, which I didn't notice, aside from, of course, Joan, who was, the contact there. But when I was watching some fan theory stuff this morning, someone said, oh, I thought I recognized a couple. And I didn't have time to go back and double check, but it's possible.
I would need to go through and just kind of like picture the actors.
Anyway, point being, my last kind of ingenuity and execution point here, Hereditary flips a common modern genre convention on its head in regards to the treatment of the paranormal. A common thing for horror of the last 20 years has been to conflate supernatural activity with mental illness and then ask the audience, well, what do you think? Was it ghosts or were they all just crazy? And if there's a movie in which the truest reality is never actually revealed, that's a loaded question. If you leave it up to the viewers to determine whether something is caused by mental illness, something that is real and provable in our world, or paranormal activity, something that is not provable in our world, you can't ask them. The average viewer is going to be forced to side with the more realistic option, even if they might like the less realistic option more. Filmmakers then sometimes, get a little smug about, oh, of course it was just a mental illness. I've created the perfect metaphor for the struggles of the mentally ill kind of thing. So films that don't commit to the supernatural or the mundane unconsciously end up committing to the mundane anyway. And what Hereditary does is the exact opposite. Ari Aster has explicitly said the cult is real, Payman is real, and should not be read as an allegory for mental illness. Further, he actually sets up the film to kind of foil the aforementioned style of horror, where he sets it up as the whole thing could be caused by mental illness. Toni Collette specifically calls out her family members that have been diagnosed with these things, being really worried about passing them on. And a lot of the film could be read as maybe she's just crazy, maybe the son is just crazy, but then bluntly tells you, no, these behaviors are explicitly due to the influence of a demonic presence and that cult. And for me, that is just a refreshing, unique take on a genre that has often been steeped in really shallow metaphors for mental illness and really sticks out as truly inventive to me.
I like that as well. For me, reality is not a movie's reality. Therefore, make your world. Make your choice.
Yep.
I've always thought that the nebulous kind of way to approach it is just not actually making the choice for your world.
You're right.
And
like
in some ways.
I
I
agree.
like that. That it's an actual choice.
Yep. Yep.
Not that there
completely
haven't been
agree.
classic ones. I mentioned The Shining earlier, and I think that's pretty much the classic example of, is it real or is he just sliding back into his alcoholism?
Well, and I think that it's fine. Like, that's not a bad place to be necessarily. I just think that that's unfortunately become kind
It's
of
a
like the
catch-all.
genre standard, you know? It's like, if you don't have anything behind your ghost story, just make it depression.
Yep.
You know, and then it's like, because people read it and feel like they need a little something extra. It can't just be a ghost story. It's got to be a metaphor for something. And you could call all of Hereditary a metaphor for grief, but that is way underselling it. You know, there's just so much more going on.
Yeah, I think so as well. And that's not to say there's not good ones. I really
There
liked
are good
Relic.
ones. I agree.
I think Relic did it in a little more basic of a way than Hereditary, but is still on the positive side, at least for me.
Relic had some really good stuff. Oh man, there's perhaps one of my favorite scenes in horror, absolutely one of my favorite scenes in the last 10 years of horror, when they start going through the rooms in the house and they just don't end. Oh boy.
Yeah,
Oh, it's
yes. That
so
was a good
good. Oh my gosh. That tickled me. That was like something that I could have imagined if I made a film and wanted to do something kind of Lovecrafty and spooky. Like, it hit so good.
Sure. I think for me, it's just the matter of tact and depth you're approaching it with.
Sure.
Is if it's just a, boop, there it is, there's your meaning. Well, yeah.
That's true.
I've criticized movies for that before, too. I think I criticized Inception for that, too.
Sure.
I think
sure.
the human story is a little tacked on.
I'd have to rewatch it. I think I saw it in theaters pretty young with the girlfriend, so I wasn't paying a lot of attention.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. The last thing
Yeah.
is just talking about inventiveness and aesthetic. And Ari Aster has earned accolades for his visual style. Inventiveness and aesthetic can be seen in Hereditary with its light switch style, day to night shots, transitions, the brilliant use of darkness in shots, as we've talked about already here, and the absolutely brutal imagery that's present throughout, and the dedication to the dour, kind of inverted, unsettling life turned terrifying. Normal or mundane scenes like the home, the school, a friend's house are turned sinister by Ari's relentless use of like spooky Easter eggs, nods to the cult, unwillingness to ever let one of these bucolic scenes evoke any sort of comfort. Aster has also been called the Wes Anderson of horror, perhaps more noticeable in the colorful, disturbing Midsummer. But I think it's safe to say that he developed a unique and really strong visual language.
I love it. It's so stately and elegant.
Yes, absolutely.
I love Framed.
He's really good with it too. He's really good with it. Hereditary has near perfect frame shots. Like,
not that there aren't movies I like that are all, personal with a handheld that get into the character's point of view.
Bryant loves Paranormal Activity. It's actually his favorite film.
But yes, if given a choice, I will take stately and framed and using the architecture and block your people within your architecture and your shot. And
something The Witch also did really well. The blocking in The Witch is like masterclass.
Oh man, I was just seeing one of those threads of paintings to film, and it was actually the end of The Witch.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah,
which is a great scene.
Yeah, which was cool. I was hopefully I can find it again. I hope I bookmarked it. But
totally.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's pretty much all I have to say about Hereditary. I mean, I know that was already quite a lot. Thank you all for sticking along and listening to that. But it was...
I had to geek out as well, man. I had my new watch and I read that script and all of a sudden I felt like I had more to say about Hereditary than New Nightmare.
Well, and the thing about New Nightmare is it's really, really fantastic. But I think... I can say for sure it's less dense. I mean, that's just... I think one of the main things we're highlighting about Hereditary here is that there's just a lot going on. You can unpack every scene. Whereas New Nightmare is a fantastic movie, but it just doesn't have, that's just not the intent of the movie. It doesn't have a secret cult following you along, Well,
it hits some of the biggest themes of all time. What struck me again this time was all of the Greek drama in their literature classes.
Totally.
There's so much that they're like, well, he's like literally ignoring all of the signs that are literally handed to him the entire play.
Yes.
And you're like, well, the incantation is written on the walls. It's written on the walls.
Literally
and they're
written
ignoring
on the walls.
So what they're discussing in literature class is exactly everybody's dilemma throughout the entire movie, which is just this other,
Another layer.
Yeah, another layer.
And I want to mention as well,
wherever they're trapped in, whatever sense of miniature they're in.
Right. Absolutely. I want to mention that as well real quick. Something I think is really cool just about, I guess, my evolution as a viewer and as a critical kind of content creator. Stuff like that, like the random classroom talkings and whatnot. I think in the past, my brain would have maybe turned off a little bit and just accepted it as scene dressing and like not cared quite as much. But it's really cool that was directly mirroring and giving more information. You know, I think there are some movies and horror movies that you might actually be in math class and those couple lines of dialogue are throwaway dialogue,
garbage.
You know,
I think my favorite's actually from Scream 2.
Okay,
they're in a film class and they're talking about sequels.
Oh god.
So it's it's kind of it's
Scream's,
kind of a joke.
Scream's always been pretty on the nose with it. But.
Yeah, but they're pretty funny. They're like sitting there being like, "Oh, sequels suck." What about Terminator 2? What about Aliens? Blah, 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 Godfather 2? Blah 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 blah.
Well, and to be fair, Aliens is fantastic. I mean, it's not as scary, but it's so real.
I mean, there are exceptions. I mean, Lord, I brought up a part 7 for this episode.
That's right, baby.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah.
Exactly.
Any closing thoughts on Hereditary?
I think I got through most of mine.
Cool. Same
here.
here.
It's just those deeper themes that nature versus nurture,
free will
versus fate, and then just the ordering. She's Toni Collette's trying to make her own life because she doesn't feel like she has the control over it.
Sure. Like the scene where she's
so deep.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes for that really sad and disturbing scene where Toni Collette is making the scene of the accident because that's how she's processing it. Yep. But the dad walks in and is literally like, "What are you doing? Like, do not let Peter see that." And she's like, "It's not about Peter." And in that moment, you're like, "Wow, she's really selfish." But like, she's speaking the truth. Like, it wasn't for him, and she's not making it with like trying to make him feel guilty. That she's just processing it.
Or she's trying to take that control back, that
right.
order.
Right.
Crazy. She has some sense of how it happened or came together.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right,
well, cool. Yeah,
I
think we did it. That's those, and then we'll do our last recurring segment here on I know what you watched last summer.
Exactly.
We'll just kind of tee off real quick about some of the things we've checked out since last episode. Go ahead, Bryant.
One of the things I wanted to bring up, another great debut movie that I got to was called Saint Maud, young filmmaker Rose Glass. And for me, what really landed, I mean, not just that it's a, great movie, well shot, put together, spooky, all of that, but that as somebody that grew up in a really religious family, it spoke to my experience in a truer way than most stuff I've seen try to handle religious topics. Sometimes it just doesn't feel like they had the same experience I had. And again, there's, 1,000 different religions and everyone practices it their own way. But for me, it's, I feel like the insularness gets brought up. I think that there's not as much a recognition that I think a lot of religious people are welcome to testing their faith. I think it's something that you're told is going to happen. And I think that when it does happen, I think a lot of people, or at least in my family, would welcome the opportunity. They see it as passing a test or proving themselves. And I think that's that aspect of it that Saint Maud gets right, that a lot of other ones don't necessarily do. She's definitely trying to proselytize. She's not just being a hospice nurse to this dying woman. She's trying to save her soul. And she is more than welcome to kind of put up with the barbs of kind of a more atheist old lady.
Huh. Super interesting. So it's on the watch list for me.
Yeah. I actually heard about it from one of your coworkers, hilariously enough.
Yeah, that's funny. That is super funny.
I actually got. And then the other thing that I saw, Promising Young Woman, which you may not have expected me to talk about, which, again, I think is another debut from a filmmaker, Emerald Fennell.
Just wait till you see that Grindhouse card and it'll all make sense.
Yeah. I was not expecting it to have so much exploitation and Grindhouse style to it. I think Alex already said, I took a picture of it and sent it to him. Even the title card is just like dripping with this old flavor. And I was like,
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to take that away from you.
It came out of nowhere for me. So I was just going to bring it up because if it was, if you were kind of going back and forth across the fence on it, a genre fan may get more out of it than they were expecting.
Totally.
I did, and I was really surprised by it.
It's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, it looks like it kind of reminded me of like a Goosebumps or something, like a cool old school like, oh yeah, that's spooky.
Exactly, it's creepy for sure. And of course, it's a great movie too. It's better than most Oscar movies, I would say.
Sure. Well, yeah, so we're running a little long on time here for this one, so I'm actually just going to skip over the stuff I've seen. It's mostly what I watched for this episode, and I watched a pretty bad horror movie that I turned off about halfway through, and I think maybe it's actually better not to mention that. I don't want to, come on here and just talk bad about something. I feel a little bit bad about that. So we'll skip over that for this time. And then the very last thing that we'll leave you with before we go, a little preview of our next episode. I think we've decided that we're going to be jumping into one of our favorite horror subgenres, body horror. And we're going to be approaching it from two different but very connected vectors, where Bryant is going to be watching Videodrome by Cronenberg, and I'm going to be watching Antiviral by the younger Cronenberg. I believe his name's Brandon, and
Yes.
I'm blanking on old Cronenberg's
David.
first, David Cronenberg. And so it's going to be really fun. We're going to do kind of an old and a new father and son kind of horror watching. And we really love body horror. So it'll be exciting to kind of jump into that.
Videodrome is one of my all-time favorites. I believe I mentioned that on the first episode. And I was really taken by Antiviral when it came out. But
Very
it's
excited.
Probably almost been a decade.
I'm really excited to
so
see it. I watched Possessor recently, and it was phenomenal.
If anything, Antiviral is almost even more topical.
Yes.
It's probably going to make more sense now than it did back at the time. I think at the time it was maybe a little anticipatory or ahead of its time, or people were like, well, I mean, I get what it's saying, but like, it's a little extreme.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kind of how Possessor feels, but I would
Sure.
not honestly be surprised if something like that becomes reality sooner than later. Anyway, not going to go on a tangent with that one too much. Thank you all so much for listening and coming and seeing us and hanging out on Film Feeds today. And we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening.